Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us from wherever you may be based today. My name is Anna Robinson. I am a partner in the employment team at Watson Farley, based in our London office. And we are absolutely delighted to welcome you all to our webinar, Waves of Progress, Women Steering the Future of ESG and Finance, which is a somewhat belated celebration of the IMO International Day for Women in Maritime, which you will know was back on 18th of May when we announced our event. Now, this year, the IMO selected the theme, An Ocean of Opportunity for Women, which was intended to spotlight pathways for leadership, participation, and impact in the global ocean economy. Now, we all know that shipping is hugely important. It carries more than 80% of global trade in goods. It's essential to everybody on the planet. And yet, sadly, it does remain a very male-dominated industry. Women only make up around 20% of onshore roles, with significantly lower participation at sea in offshore roles. And whilst we've seen encouraging growth in representation, particularly in shore-based roles, there is still a huge amount of work that still lies ahead. So today we honour the achievements of women in the sector, but we also reflect on the important work that still lies ahead of us. So today's session will be broadly split into two parts. I will moderate the first part of the session with a focus on what I would describe as HR or policy operational type questions, which feeds into my background and experience, before handing over to my colleague Kate Silverstein, who many of you will know is an asset finance partner at Watson Farley, and she will be focusing on ESG in the ship finance side. Now, of course, we want to hear from all of you. So if you have any questions, then do please feel free to add those to the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. They can be anonymised if you prefer. And if we don't have time to address those, then perhaps we can come back to you separately if you let us know your contact details by email. So without further ado, I am delighted to welcome our four very distinguished speakers today. First, let me introduce you to Sarah Choudhry, who many of you will know is General Counsel at CoolCo. And Sarah has over 17 years of specialist experience in the shipping industry in a variety of sectors, including tankers, containers, offshore supply, and bulk carriers. Sarah began her career at the law firm Reed Smith before moving to Navigate Group and later to Eastern Pacific. Sarah brings a wealth of experience from the shipping space and is a strong voice on legal and operational issues. Welcome, Sarah. Also delighted to introduce Lesley Cotton. Lesley is the former CPO at P&O Ferries and Ferrymasters. In 2020, after a decade of service in that role, she resigned to establish her own consultancy business, and Lesley is also an executive coach. And I should mention that Lesley left P&O 18 months before the well-publicised exit of the UK crew, so that wasn't on her watch. But whilst the focus of today is all things maritime, it's great to have Lesley with us because she has so much experience across a broad range of industries and sectors, and we'll be really interested in her insight on work done at C-suite and board level. So welcome, Lesley. Thirdly, we have Hannah Gilbert. Hannah is a policy advisor at the UK Chamber of Shipping. Hannah started her career as an ombudsman before joining the Chamber in 2022. And she provides policy advice across a whole range of issues. Many of you will have worked with her, I'm sure, on legal, insurance, employment, and commercial issues, as well as sustainability-related disclosure requirements. Hannah actively participates in BIMCO's documentary committee, and she's also represented UK ship owners in meetings of the ILO's Special Tripartite Committee, established under the MLC. And last but by no means least, we are also very pleased to welcome Yan Tan. Yan is Director of Transportation and Logistics at ING, based in Singapore, and brings nearly 20 years' experience spanning maritime, offshore oil and shipping finance. She began her career as a management trainee with Neptune Orient Lines before moving to specialised ship finance roles at both Nordea and ING, working with maritime, working on complex vessel financing and banking solutions. So thank you to all of you for joining us today. Now, I did at this stage want to bring in the audience a little bit, because I know it's always difficult with webinars to get a feel for the participants in the room. So I would like to understand a bit more the demographic of the audience, which I think will help the speakers when we have our questions. So I will add a couple of poll questions to the screen. So first of all, I'm interested to know which area of the shipping sector you work in. If you could just pick one choice from that list. The second question, just to sort of do a bit of a deep dive into the gender ratio split, and this might be a best guesstimate. Can you let me know, broadly speaking, what the gender split is in your organisation? And I've put some percentage bands on the screen. Give you a few moments just to answer those questions. We'll see if we have a nice cross section. Oh, okay, right. So we do have a split. We have a lot of legal participants. And I think that's not just Watson Farley participants, but also quite a number of in-house lawyers. And then if we look at the gender split, okay, so not perhaps as pessimistic as I expected, although I think that might be slightly reflective of the high percentage of legal where women tend to be better represented, but still definitely more work to do, because 53% are only looking at 20 to 40% women. Okay, so if I could turn now to my speakers, I just wanted to start, if I may, with a bit of a general question, and I'd like to try, I know it's difficult, but try and condense this fairly briefly with a 2-minute answer from each of you. But I'd be interested to know what your journey's been like as a woman in the industry, and particularly, I suppose, how you think the landscape has changed over the years. And if I could start by asking Sarah that question, if I may.
Hi, good morning, everyone. As Anna mentioned, my journey in the maritime industry began in private practice at Reed Smith, and I moved in-house over 10 years ago. As we're all aware, the industry is male-dominated, but there has been a noticeable shift over the years. For example, when I was in private practice, women were well represented at trainee and associate level, but there were only a handful of female partners. The clients were predominantly male, but there were a few exceptions of women in senior positions, but those were rare. Now, there are more female partners in law firms and more women in shipping companies, particularly in senior leadership roles. Also, notably, roles that were more traditionally male-dominated departments, such as technical and commercial operations. So overall, over the last 18 years or 16 years, there has been improvement and the landscape has gradually changed. But as I think we all agree, there is definitely room for improvement.
And do you think it's accelerated towards the latter part of your career, or do you think it's been slow and steady progress?
I think it's actually accelerated.
Okay.
And I think that is partly to do with the initiatives that have been, that we see all the time. And also the growing impact of organisations such as WISTA, where you get that mentorship and sort of leadership programmes. Yeah. So I think that has helped significantly.
Okay, so that's a positive message. Lesley, did you want to come in at this stage?
Thank you, Anna, and welcome to everybody. And Anna, thank you for the introduction. Much appreciated. Yeah, so my experience, I joined P&O Ferries, you mentioned in 2010, and I joined directly as their Chief People Officer. I'd never experienced the sector or the world of trade unions. Applying for the job, fascinated by the sector, thinking, well, I'll never get this job because of those very facts. And there I was for 10 years. And the learning curve was steep and fascinating. I thoroughly enjoyed my time. People are people in whatever sector you work in. They've got the same needs to feel respected, heard, cared for, and to be treated fairly and with integrity, especially when the message that you need to deal with is perhaps a tough one. That's the time I used to call it tough love. How you execute professionally is the most important bit with care. So my 10 years, we changed the executive committee. So through sort of succession planning and thought, we managed to get the females around the table to 66%, which was quite unheard of, really. And that carried on for quite some years. It did evolve over the time, and it wasn't the same percentage at the time I chose to resign. And there's no doubt that a breadth and diversity of thought leadership is needed at the decision table, as well as through the business. But if you think of a business as a shadow of the leadership team, it's critical that you strive for that mix at that level, and then how you shadow that throughout the organization. We had our senior leaders at over 40% female. But hearing your statistics, Anna, and we're clear that 20%, less than 20% of the workforce across maritime are female, with considerably less at sea. We've got a lot to do, I think, around the accessibility and the attractiveness and how we make that career work for females. And I think there's some fresh and innovative thinking that we need to really step back, I think, and sort of disrupt the way that we would typically look at this. And I haven't got the answer, but I'm clear that doing the same thing, more of the same thing, well, we know Einstein's theory of madness, it is not going to change the result. So yes, I've seen progress, I think, in the realization that change is required. Great webinars like we're here today, the work that Worcester does, some really, really good work out there about the need to attract and retain women in the sector. But I think we need to challenge ourselves as to what that step change in reality is going to be.
Okay, agreed. And maybe we'll talk in a moment, Lesley, about the initiatives which you found to be particularly successful at your time at P&O. Hannah, if I could bring you in at this stage, are you able just to précis your journey? Sorry, journey sounds terribly cliche, but it's a good
No,
one in the
it is. No,
circumstances.
thank you very much, Anna. Thank you very much for the question. Thank you very much, Watson Farley Williams, for hosting. Good morning, everyone. I appreciate might not be able to set the world to rights in an hour, but I'm excited to cover what remains a very pertinent topic. And I do think that your question is a very interesting one. What it is like being a woman in a male-dominated industry, but which at the same time is also very international in its nature. It also involves people from all different walks of life, all different stages of their life, different cultures, different religions. And I think having been in the industry now for about 3.5 years, maybe the later stages of the industry, I do still think that in that time frame, everything that probably could have happened has happened. So I do think it has been very much a learning curve. But I also do think that I have been incredibly privileged. From the very start, I'm very grateful to have been working with a very diverse range of assertive, engaging professional women in all different roles and levels. And even if they haven't sort of been a direct mentor for me, they have provided a wealth of lessons to learn from, by seeing them sort of present to an audience, seeing how they engage with their peers, seeing them engage with those in less senior positions, those in more senior positions, women who haven't risen to the top and decided to sort of pull the ladder up behind them, but really wanting and are willing to sort of foster that sense of camaraderie, that sense of belonging that is always very helpful when you walk into a room and you are sort of the only two women there. And I appreciate that can be daunting for some. So, I do remember very early on as well having the sort of conversation about the dynamics of that. I remember distinctly being told, do not be the one to offer the teas and coffees out in the first instance, not because that isn't a valid job, but because it shouldn't automatically be seen as your job. Hence why I do think there is a lot to be said about, having women in mentor or leadership positions, which I appreciate we're going to hear from Lesley on a bit later on as well. And to be fair, I've also very much worked with men who have had the nous, shall we say, which doesn't always happen, to recognise that working in a male-dominated industry does bring with it a sort of different working relationship. So that's all to say that I think my experience overall has been very positive so far within the industry. You know, I think we do sort of take it as read that diversity in the workplace is a sort of good thing. It can be spoken about in a sort of very airy-fairy type of manner, but I think being able to offer the perspective of sort of the later years of the industry, you know, having from not understood the full nuances of what is a very varied and very exciting industry to be able to work in, to now actually being invited to speak at events like this because I have been given the opportunities and the tools and the support that I need to be able to succeed and continue to grow. So I do think that does give me some confidence that we as an industry can also do the same as well.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say about mentoring and role models. That was certainly the case for my career. In terms of women being assertive, it's a bit of a controversial question, but do you think women have to be assertive to succeed in the industry, or is it about
Absolutely
being
not.
authentic?
Yes, exactly. No, and I do think, like you said, that saying that you have to be assertive is you know, can be slightly controversial, as you say, and you know, you should be respectful irrespective of whether you are, you know, assertive in the points that you put forward, and that is the exact point, isn't it? But you know,
Yeah,
it's more to illustrate the fact that I've worked with a lot of diverse range of women, some of whom who have been very assertive, but also professional, engaging in other ways as well.
yeah, great. And finally, Ganyan, if we could hear from you.
Yeah, thank you, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. So when I started in shipping in the early 2000s, I was typically, you know, one of the few women in the room at industry events or at meetings, and this was in Asia, right? And the landscape is very, very male dominated, as you guys have mentioned, and so, you know, networking or even speaking up can feel quite challenging. But I think things have changed, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years, and that's really accelerated, I think, by the conversations such as these that we are having now. You know, having women in meetings is just so much more common. We see female CFOs, head of treasuries, senior bankers that are female. So I think the conversation has really shifted from whether you know, women belong in shipping to whether, you know, whether we can do better as an industry to retain, to attract diverse talents. So overall, I think we've come a long way, but I think we still have work to do, especially at the more senior levels, as the numbers show.
And I always think it's about investing in women in the longer term, because I think it might be the case, without wanting to generalize, that they take some time out for family related reasons, but most people want to come back to work, don't they? So it's about taking that longer term perspective and investing in women, recognizing that they will be with you for much longer than 1 or 2 years. And again, that was certainly my experience at Watson Farley, that long-term investment. Thank you. That was really insightful and interesting. If I could just now direct a more focused question to you, Lesley. And this is really, again, focusing on your time at P&O Ferries and also, I suppose, from your conversations with industry leaders. How do we drive forward what I would describe as meaningful change, where we are embedding D&I into hearts and minds as a cultural shift? Because I suppose, looking at it cynically, we don't just want it to be a reaction to legislative change, do we?
Yeah, and thanks, Anna. Let me give you a couple of thoughts. And I did want to give you a thought on the word assertive, if that helps.
Yes.
The previous point.
Yeah.
So let me do that, and then I'll come on to this point about how do you become proactive around that cultural shift rather than just a policy that tells you have to.
Yeah.
So on the assertive point, there's something that I use quite well with clients is something called the support challenge model. Many people will have heard it, so I don't want to teach people to suck eggs. But there is always an appropriate point where assertiveness is required, whether you're male or female. And if you can get this, if you think of a 2x2 matrix, high support, high challenge, and you're in that box, so you've got the support right and the challenge right, I think the assertiveness works. If you do the assertiveness with no support, it lands badly. So that's just something to think about in terms of your leadership style and your credibility, your characteristics. If you can balance the fact you are a supportive collegiate colleague, but I will support as appropriate, I think the assertiveness works. rather than being a blunt instrument. Right,
Yeah.
just a thought. Let me come back to your question. Sorry, I went off piece there, didn't I? So
No, it's great. It's really interesting. Thank you.
In terms of your question, I think that the point here for me is all about mindset change. So let's start from the premise that, you know, we operate in line with legislation, we understand policies, we understand the need, whether it be in terms of diversity and inclusion, but actually there's so much more to it. And I talk about something called the optimum performance model. So what do I mean by that? I mean that you have to get your policies in place, you have to operate within the law, you have to understand the legislation that you need to work to. But on the other side of that balance, if you think of a set of scales, is all the people side. What do I mean? I mean the mindset, the attitude, the care, the coach, the mentoring, and those two things need to work in harmony to gain optimum performance, whether it be for the people and ultimately the business, because businesses are there to make a profit. They're there to serve stakeholders and shareholders, and that has to happen. So in terms of this point for me around embedding things in culture, there needs to be the sort of the education and the mindset more than just a policy shift of we've got to do this. This needs to be in here. This needs to be about the requirement within, like you're thinking about your employee value proposition, that we are going to drive the need for diversity and inclusion because we know it actually serves us well and it's the right thing to do. It's not because we're ticking a box, it's because we see, as in the leaders of this business, all of the value that diversity can bring to this business, and we want to be inclusive, and we see the need to actually serve our community, which includes that point of inclusion. So there's an education point, there's a budget point, because education needs a budget behind it, because typically it needs these type of events or workshops or something within an organization that may well cost money because you've got to get people off vessels. We know none of that is easy, or have an innovative approach to how you actually coach people and train people around this subject. But people need to live it. It's not just a policy and, oh God, we need to do this. It's how we behave. And that's the shift, I think. Does that make sense?
No, it makes absolute sense. I think with policies, that's the absolute bare minimum, right?
Yeah.
I think certainly in the training I've done and the work that some of my clients have done, it's about bringing it alive, making it relevant. And that might be role plays, really interactive training, examples of cases, real life cases that have gone through the courts. So it becomes less abstract.
Yeah.
And then I think people understand it, but having that staff manual on a shelf somewhere is not enough. So it's thinking about how to really bring it alive. I was interested earlier when you said women bring a different perspective to the table, and that diversity of thought piece. That's obviously what you've experienced in practice.
Yes, 100%. My concern in answering this question is we don't want to rely on sort of stereotypes.
No, I know it's difficult. You don't want to sound like you're generalizing.
But for the purpose of the question, I will generalize, because I think there is some validity to the generalization. Gosh, it sounds like I'm sitting on the shelf, doesn't it, with the answer? I mean, my experience of a 66% female executive committee, and I apologise because I'm going to be slightly controversial. There is a ratio between ears and mouth. And a lot of people are in transmit mode more than they listen. There is a real art to listening. Generally, my experience is that women do that with a high degree of skill, and they will pause and listen. And the quality of the debate, therefore, is very different to people just voicing a view. There will be a level of curiosity and questioning and listening and appreciating of perspectives that is slightly different. And I don't want to insult all the high percentage of men that will also fall into that camp. But I'm just giving a generalization of my experience that the debate changes when you have a high percentage of females around the table, and they look at things, they ask different questions. We're born differently, you know, and people do ask different questions. So it's quite interesting.
It's that quiet confidence piece, isn't it? Having the confidence to sit back, reflect, absorb, before commenting.
Yes.
So there isn't too much noise in the room.
And it's the, you need both. I'm not saying it's got to, it would be completely wrong if you had 80% females. You need that diversity and the different style of question that a male might bring to the table versus the female, or anything in between. It's important that you get that balance. That's the point. And we don't mean diversity to be just male female, do we?
No. Diversity across all different protected characteristics, definitely. Thank you. Hannah, could I ask a question of you, drawing on your background as a policymaker? How do you think regulators and industry bodies can drive meaningful progress on promoting diversity? I know that's a big question.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. And maybe just very quickly to springboard off of what Lesley was just saying as well, that I completely agree with what she was saying in terms of promoting gender diversity and diversity in general has to be a common goal for everyone within the business, because as Lesley said, this isn't just a sort of tick box exercise, as it were. The reality is that if you have a diverse range of people working within the business, you will achieve better results within the company, and that means that you have to proactively work together to more effectively tackle the issue. It shouldn't just be the job of one particular part of the business, one particular gender, one class of people. It has to be that sort of collective, collaborative, multi-pronged approach. And this will only work essentially if everyone sort of comes along with us, really, I think. So I think if we start with the perspective of the regulators, and I do think it is a fairly obvious place for me to start, but I do think that it is important to highlight that as a regulator, you need to be taking the steps to ensure effective enforcement of your anti-discrimination laws. And that is absolutely key. You need to be able to hold the bad actors accountable if they are not complying. Send the message that that is not and will not be accepted within the industry. And as a regulator, I think you are also in a very sort of unique position, as it were, in being able to sort of monitor and track where and how these types of incidents occur. I know that the International Maritime Organization, for example, publish reports jointly with WISTA, and they report on the number of women in maritime, and they break it down by things like country role, how many are sat on company boards, recruitment and retention rates and things like that. And that means that they are able to see what progress and actually monitor what has been done in the last few years to try and encourage more women, not only to try and join the industry, but also want to actually stay in the industry as well. But, as a regulator, it doesn't all have to be doom and gloom as well. It doesn't just have to be reporting. You are in a unique position that others will look to you for guidance. So you have the opportunity as a regulator to be able to uplift and highlight those companies who are not just playing by the rules, but also going above and beyond, championing those who actively and publicly promote inclusive leadership practices, who do all of the sort of unconscious bias training with their workforce, who establish sort of mentorship or buddy programs, as it were, to try and show that they are wanting to encourage more women to join the industry. And I think to accompany that as well, and to accompany the benefits and the workings of utilising that sort of top-down culture shift approach that Lesley just spoke about, as well, as opposed to sort of bottom-up. I do think that industry bodies like trade associations can help be a bridge, I suppose, in sort of connecting industry partners with like-minded folk who want to see change and may not know where to start. Particularly for smaller entities, I do think, understandably, that the focus does start from compliance. That is the bottom line. They're just trying to get through their sort of day-to-day business. But if you want to be able to reach those people so that it's not just sort of an echo chamber, as it were, it's not just sort of the same people showing up to try and evidence their commitments to gender diversity, which is obviously great. But more is more, I do think, in this instance. That you can have that sort of platform, so it's not just a sort of talking shop. It's an opportunity to share sort of best practices, to give practical examples, I suppose, of where to start and how you embed this within your company's culture, so that it's not just sort of seen as an add-on. It is a change in mindsets, and sort of given that diversity should be actively promoted and preserved. So it's all to say that I think there are some real practical steps that can be taken to really encourage that sort of cross-industry, cross-stakeholder engagement on what remains a very important topic. We've done a lot of work, but there's still a long way to go on this.
Yeah, there's no silver bullet, is there?
Yeah.
It's a bit of a controversial question, but do you think it's problematic that most of our audience members today are women?
So I think reflecting on that, I do think that's probably reflective of the fact that as soon as you start talking about this type of topic, it still, I think, does tend to lean more towards um, being more, I suppose, attractive to the women who want to find out what ways there are to try and boost the numbers, as it were. But I do think that this is obviously a journey that we do need the men in the audience as well to come along with us. And obviously, we do have some men in the audience, and that's incredibly encouraging. And I suppose that, it would be nice maybe in a year's time to kind of double check and look back on what has happened in the last year, to be able to reflect on what we have all done as an industry, really, not just the women in the team to try and promote the numbers, but also the men, to try and help support and provide that support, I suppose.
Yeah, because it's not an adversarial debate, is it? It's really about a collective effort. I think that's the point. Lesley, did you want to just comment on that point?
Yes, sorry. And to build on Hannah's point, I mean, I'm absolutely clear on this. We need to encourage change the mix of who we talk to about this subject. We need to work in partnership with our male colleagues to drive a different agenda, to drive a different result, rather, because it's great that in terms of the way that the females in the audience and whoever's in the audience want to actually shift the dial on this whole subject, but wouldn't it be refreshing if sort of our male colleagues were leading more assertively on this subject, were promoting this, and many will. But I think to do it in partnership and to see them talking about this subject matter far more proactively, I think would really help shift the dial. And it's up to us to think about how we achieve that, would be my thought on this one.
Okay, thank you. And just while I've got you, Lesley, I did just want to slightly shift the subject focus. Just thinking about another hot topic, particularly from the last 5 years, I suppose, which is crew welfare. I know that you were involved in a lot of crew welfare initiatives, and I suppose I'm thinking about how those initiatives might also help women, just in terms of making particularly offshore roles more attractive. Is it worth just talking to some of that a little bit so we can hear from you as to what was effective?
Yeah, of course. And yes, when I was at P&O Ferries, my team led a major wellbeing initiative across the business. It was you mentioned shoreside, didn't you? It was particularly pertinent on vessels, and I'll say why, but it incorporated shoreside. But why did we do it? If I come back to the optimum performance model analogy that I mentioned earlier, which is something I sort of try to work to, because he's always like, well, what's the business case as well as the well-being people side? Well, why are we doing this? Because it's an investment. It needs a budget to actually, if you're serious about this in terms of how do you want to shift the dial on this. So we at the time had 10 million pounds of absence costs. So if you think of the methodology, the issue, that was the business issue. So if I'm putting a business case together for a board as to why I want to put a budget and invest in this, that's what they're interested in, as well as the well-being of their crew, which is critical. But there is a business payback to why you would do this. And the measurement which was ongoing up to when I left, was, well, unfortunately, COVID came and took it off track, was that we would demonstrate £1 million to the owners of improvement. But actually, for me, it was, we have an issue here about how do we care for our people. It's a tough environment, it's a tough industry, it's tough shoreside, and it's tough on vessels. And we also could see that through the ENG1 process, the medical process for seafarers, that also indicated that there needed to be some shift. And we knew for some crew members, if you think about practice and mindset, we come back to my mindset point, they were going to bed off night shift, and some of them were setting their alarm to get up during their sleep period to have a cooked breakfast. And you sort of think, that's a bit counterintuitive. And actually, we also looked at our menu offering across the business, and we knew, and this is a pun, we were feeding the problem. And therefore, we needed to think about the educational point. So we put a whole strategy together around steps that we were going to do over a period of time. We worked with occupational health, my team did, they worked closely. Made sure, and particularly on vessels, that the offering incorporated different types of food. And we did a whole education around this. And we also did a whole body monitoring your metabolic age. And it was that really got people shocked. Because once you start to talk to people about their metabolic age, it starts to hit home, and the health issues. So it was a complete education. And I mean, I'm proud to say that one of the crew, actually, it was a member of one of the trade union. We worked with them very well at the time. Actually put us forward for an award, because we had the statistics of weight loss and metabolic ages reducing was absolutely stunning. So I can't tell you whether we saved £1 million, because at that point we then got into COVID. But was I very, very happy that our crew and our shoreside people could see it through the work we did with them? But I apologise that I've shifted the answer more into the crew side, but they actually were the ones that could see the difference. And from the female point of view, yeah, I mean, we had people, whether it be shoreside or our female, particularly on the onboard services side, there was a much more high percentage of women than on the engineering side. They just thought this was brilliant. You know,
and I think that the younger generation now, well, generally, actually, people are much more focused on
yes,
wellness, aren't they?
yeah. But it's interesting, because you've got some long service, very fixed mindset individuals, and like, what do you mean you're not? I can't have my pie and chips and my cooked breakfast. You know what? Some of it is slowly. You know, baby steps. It's about
pie and chips and the cooked breakfast. Blimey. Hannah, do you mind coming in at this stage? What have you seen in the crew welfare space that's been effective, do you think?
Thank you very much for the question, Anna. And yes, again, just to piggyback off of Leslie's point as well, I do think that we've already touched upon some of the policies, initiatives, actions that we've seen that have really been successful in fostering a sort of safe and inclusive working environment, which also, sort of feeds into the safeguarding the welfare of the crew as well. And of course, because as has already been mentioned, there's not a sort of end to the journey as society evolves. So do sort of expectations as well of the crew members. And in order to be able to make sure that you are meeting the needs of your crew members, and Lesley did sort of talk around this subject as well, but establishing regular communication channels is absolutely key. Staying in touch with your crew members. At the end of the day, you might think that you have the best policies, the best mental health support, the best facilities in place, that type of thing. But at the end of the day, that is your view, and you are not the one who is having to use them, working at sea. So, and I do think that by encouraging that sort of speak up culture, having those touch points, I do think the reality is that if you do it right, you will likely see an increase in complaints. But that is not necessarily actually a bad thing in and of itself, because what that means is you now have a culture of people who are on the ground who feel as if they are safe and supported enough to be able to raise concerns, and that means that you now also have the opportunity to be able to do something about it. And I think particularly when it comes to things like mental health support, you do need to have that sort of feedback loop, as it were. You need to be able to understand if you are sort of getting it right. And in addition to sort of the regular check-ins, the access to communication channels and things like that as well, we have seen an increase in what some refer to as sort of mental health first aid sort of courses. Some may call it a different name, but it is essentially sort of training, as it were, to try and teach sort of crew members about possible danger signs to look out for, reducing the stigma when you do talk about the topic, that type of thing, having a sort of a buddy system in place. But of course, it's not just placed on the crew members at sea as well to kind of identify it. It is also about having the support shoreside as well, so that they are not just navigating the issue by themselves. You have designated people ashore to be able to speak to. You might have hotlines, resources, that type of thing, to be able to provide appropriate support. But I do recognise that obviously some people might not feel comfortable, talking to a complete stranger about what they're thinking, what they're feeling. So I do think that being able to offer appropriate internet packages, things like that, so that people at sea are able to still connect with their loved ones. And it sounds so simple, but that really can make such a difference in their experience whilst they're on their tours of duty, which may be for extended periods of time, as we know. And in addition to that, I think we've really seen a range of initiatives which really try and foster the sort of team dynamic, as it were. You can't have the sort of hour of forced fun. You can't force it. But if you are offering things like, I don't know, karaoke nights, film nights, sports matches, things like that, we've really seen that actually that really reflects and helps crew members who may be sort of self-isolating, as it were. Because again, the opposite of that is that if you are offering internet packages, which means that crew members are going back to their rooms and only sitting on their phones, that might not necessarily be the best thing either. So it's a sort of balancing act, as it were. You want to be able to promote and foster that team dynamic without, sort of forcing the fun, as it were.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think loneliness and isolation are the big problems, aren't they? And I can imagine that as a woman on a vessel, as a minority, that problem must be magnified. So it's particularly important, I think, to think of inclusive ways of bringing people together. And you're right, without Wi-Fi, we're all hopeless without our phones, aren't we? So
absolutely can't live without it
can't
nowadays.
live without them, sadly. But I think progress has been made on that front. Okay, so if I could just ask you, actually, Lesley, if I ask the question of you before handing over to Kate. And this is focusing solely on women again, and it's a general question. I'm sorry, but what do you see as the biggest challenges ahead, particularly in seafaring roles, and what can the industry do to better support women overcome those obstacles? And it's a big macro question. I'm sorry, but any thoughts on that?
It is a big question, and I was about to say we can't boil the ocean, and I thought I must stop using dreadful puns. But if I try and I think there's two major buckets of focus. One is, I think, around working practices and sea time, and how does that relate to a women's role in their home? And different women will have different roles. There is a suggestion, isn't there, or predominantly that the women will be thinking more about childcare. There'll be a high percentage of men that will say, well, no, I do that. But typically, if we think about that, how do we make the working practices in the sea time more attractive? And I'll show that flexibility to accommodate different needs. I think the other one, I'm probably sorry, I should also talk about things like roles where more physical strength was needed, and now how technology will affect that. So there is a technology sort of slant within that. I think there is another thing that we can't ignore, but that is the issue of conduct and things that may happen on vessels whereby behaviour is poor or completely inappropriate conduct. Those issues are out there. They're not everywhere, and there will be the majority of men that will be as appalled at that as women. However, I do believe that more needs to be done in order to educate as to how that dynamic needs to work when people are in a private space away from home and need to feel safe and secure. And there are occasions when that is broken, and that still needs to be dealt with. So I don't think there's a magic bullet, Anna. I think it is back to education and businesses being very, very clear on their policies around those things and educating people about the behaviour that's expected, and for men to call it out on a vessel when they see something that they know is inappropriate, not to go quiet. That will help shift the dial on that issue. I think on the working practices, where you've got a ferry versus something that another vessel that's at sea for far more hours, I think there is opportunity to be more inventive. I mean, we were doing things around working practices, job shares. We did, in fact, recruit a female that became the first female master across the sector, and she's gone on to do other great things in her career. and the female had the women have a different attitude of mind as well. So I think there is a bit about self-help from women. How do they want to approach this? They want a career in a sector that has these working conditions. So how do they want to flex and adapt? And I think both parties need to come together, with the employer being open-minded as to how can they change those practices, with the flexibility that the female wants to bring to that conversation as well.
Okay, so family-friendly related policies and initiatives are still really important, obviously. It's quite interesting what you mentioned about, because I think you're talking about sexual harassment, aren't you, when you talk about safe spaces. I always think one of the challenges is that we're not dealing, obviously, with we're not just dealing with UK nationals. Most crew members won't be UK nationals. And legally, if you think about the legal definition of harassment, so for example, the definition in the Equality Act in the UK, everybody has a different perception and perspective on what harassment means. So I think it's quite difficult to find a common ground sometimes as to what's acceptable on board a vessel, and people will come with a different, I suppose, cultural approach and background and social background. So it's a challenge, I think, when you're bringing together different nationalities. It's not just about the gender piece. There are cultural differences as well, which make it a challenge.
Yeah, I think you're right. I do think, though, the clarity of, you don't enter a female's cabin uninvited.
Yeah.
And you certainly don't enter their shower uninvited. I think there are some very clear barriers that are non-negotiable, but I do think around the edges, I think you're right, there will be nuances where there will be differences culturally. But I think there are some very hard lines of black and white, thou shalt not.
Yeah, of course. Okay, thank you. I'm conscious of time, so again, thank you, Hannah and Lesley. We'll come back to you at the end, but I'm now going to hand over to Kate to focus on the financing side. Kate.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Anna. And thank you to all of you so far for some really insightful and interesting comments and ideas. We are now going to transition into the second section of our webinar today and shift our focus to the intersection of finance and sustainability in the shipping space. But having listened to Hannah and Lesley and Anna's sort of insights so far, I do think there's actually quite a lot of overlap and points to consider around things not being a tick box exercise. So we're going to now speak to Sarah and Yuan, and we're going to explore how sustainable finance is impacting the sector, and look at whether it is improving in any way the visibility and impact of women in this field, or how it might do that. So let's kick off and delve into the strategies, challenges and successes in this area. Sarah, I'll start with you. How do you think sustainable financing can contribute to closing the gender gap across the maritime sector? And why is that important?
Thank you for the question, Kate. It plays a role by closing the gender gap by linking financial incentives to gender-related performance targets. Tools like sustainability-linked loans and bonds provide borrowers with preferential rates and in favourable terms when they meet specific diversity targets. This creates a strong financial motivation for borrowers to prioritise gender inclusion. But what does this mean in practice? By tying these financial benefits to measurable KPIs, sustainability financing encourages borrowers to adopt, for example, improved hiring practices, invest in targeted training, and develop leadership pathways for women, actions they might not have otherwise taken. The model has already been demonstrated success in the environmental sphere. For example, environmental linked financing, such as interest rate reductions for achieving better AER scores. This has helped companies transition to greener operations. And it's this model that's now being used in this type of financing. Sustainability financing and the associated financial rewards, both lower borrowing costs and better loan conditions, can therefore act as a catalyst for borrowers to implement gender inclusive initiatives, thereby helping close the gender gap. However, as we've discussed, the benefit of diversity is more than just a financial gain. As we both Lesley and Hannah mentioned, it's a very general view, but diversity has been shown to benefit companies, such as increased innovation, enhanced decision making, and a stronger, more resilient workforce. So, as I see it, in essence, sustainability financing is more than just a tool to reduce costs. It can act as the nudge for companies to implement measures to improve gender equality. And in turn, the company can benefit from not only financial, but also operational benefits. And linking back to one of the points that Lesley made is that you need to find the funding to promote the training and so on. So by offering financial incentives, that releases the budget for these gender initiatives that the companies then can use towards to implement these measures.
Thank you, Sarah. I think that's so interesting, isn't it? That concept of a nudge, which then leads to meaningful change. And Yuan, I think we're all very familiar with sustainability-linked loans. Watson Farley have advised on a sustainability-linked loan that had a sort of women in leadership metric as one of the KPIs, which led to a margin ratchet. And that also, there were also the more usual environmental linked KPIs in that loan as well. This particular gender metric was sort of the number of women in leadership roles at the borrower entity. Have you seen examples, Yuan, of sort of this type of sustainability linked financing in ship finance agreements where you have embedded gender linked metrics into the ESG covenants? And do you think they're helpful?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think the market has started moving in this direction. I think if you recall, the first few sustainability-linked loans were all focused pretty much on emissions as KPIs, sort of environmental metrics. But I think now we're starting to see companies implement social KPIs, so gender diversity, safety performance, community development even. But in general, I think KPIs focusing on S&G are still relatively few actually in shipping. Notable examples I think that have been made public would be the Navigator Gas one. 22% women in leadership targets by 2023, and then scaling annually to 2028, 35%. And I think this was one of probably the first few gender diversity linked loans in shipping. The other one that comes to mind is actually BW Epic Kosan, who also has a KPI but rather targeting increased female seafarers participation rather than shore-based leadership. So it's actually quite an interesting trend that increasingly, companies are making gender diversity quite a central ESG target beyond just doing sustainability-linked loans and linking them and putting them as KPIs. I think the one that leads the pack is actually Maersk, and it has actually linked its ESG metrics to compensation for its executives, which is in my mind actually a very powerful indicator and a good sort of way to sort of kick everything in action, because when it hits the wallet, then that's where you see people start to move and take action. There are also many European and Asian listed companies that have set similar form of targets, like Hafnia, I think Hapag and Yangming. So in general, I think the point is that we are starting to move, I think, beyond just basic headcount metrics to more meaningful progression indicators. And by that, I don't mean just looking at where we end up at the end, but rather at the sort of process itself. We are talking about succession planning. We're talking about collaborations with schools, mentorship programs, leadership development for women, which is very important because this then sets up a system for you to actually cultivate the next generation of women to come up and succeed in leadership roles. So I think all in all, this is a really helpful exercise, and it definitely signals that gender is part of the ESG conversation, not just an HR issue, and it establishes a precedent. And once a lot of the major players actually adopt such gender-linked KPIs, it actually becomes easier for other people to follow.
No, absolutely. That's really interesting. And I think those other examples of sort of what other KPIs are being used is fascinating, and it's, I think, will become more and more commonplace. Sarah, are there any other gender relevant KPIs that you're familiar with or have seen in the market?
I was going to say I completely echo what Yuan said as well. And one of the ones was the number of female seafarers on board. It's a straightforward and quantifiable metric, which makes it attractive for lenders. However, given the current limited global pool of female seafarers, meeting this KPI could be quite challenging for borrowers. Overall, hard KPIs are good, but how do women go about increasing the number of women on board? And as Yuan mentioned, it's not just about hard headcount. It's not just about recruitment. It's about the bigger picture. It's about implementing the right policies and cultures, which are points that Hannah and Lesley raised earlier. Also, the number of women seafarers is only part of the picture. Retention rates are equally important, as is long-term progression. This requires a company to invest in, for example, mentorship programs and leadership development. Taking those aspects into consideration, whilst we're seeing sort of hard number KPIs, I think the approach needs to be more nuanced and should look at more metrics like the number of female cadets on board, retention rates of female seafarers, and the representation of former seafarers in technical or leadership roles ashore. I believe these broader metrics better reflect the entire ecosystem needed to support female seafarers in their career in maritime, from entry level to long-term progression. And it provides a bigger picture of the sustainable gender advancement. So, for example, at CoolCo, we don't have any finance-linked KPIs, but if we were to look at it and look at the number of female seafarers on board, we'd actually find it quite difficult to achieve because we have a high crew retention rate, so we haven't had to recruit in recent years. However, that doesn't mean we're not committed to promoting women. And so instead, we're focusing on cadets and trying to increase the number of female cadets we have on board. We've spoken to our local crewing agencies to explain that we'd like to see more applicants from female cadets. And we're also looking to implement various measures on board, such as female-specific PPE. This all helps create a safer and more inclusive environment. So my overall view is whilst hard number KPIs are useful, there are various steps that I think if we can link some KPIs to those as well, we might get more borrower engagement. And it will help encourage and nurture the ecosystem that will lead to meeting those hard number metrics.
Thank you. I think that's such a good point. As we touched on at the beginning, there's a better gender balance, isn't there, on the onshore roles, and it's sort of harder to comply with that when you get to looking at crew. And so it is, those hard metrics are difficult. But I suppose maybe the argument is that starting somewhere sort of generates the discussion, and then things get honed and are sort of more applicable. I am conscious we are running out of time rapidly, but I'm just going to ask Yuan. Do you think this focus on sustainability and the S and the G piece of ESG will be able to create new opportunities for women in the sector?
Yeah, I think absolutely. In a very direct way, actually, the sustainability transformation is actually generating new jobs that didn't exist 5 to 10 years ago. For instance, I think the number of maritime firms reporting ESG metrics have more than doubled since 2020s. So shipping firms are needing to build ESG teams, carbon credit accounting teams, compliance teams, and these are sort of all new career pathways that are new, that don't have legacy biases. So I think women can enter and advance without being boxed in to old categories, which again, I think open the doors for more inclusive hiring and leadership. And it's also, I think, important to know, actually, a lot of companies that focus on sustainability initiatives pursue aggressive decarbonization targets often tend to report very good diversity metrics that are higher than industry averages, just simply because of the mindset of the leaders. So in short, I think we're at a cusp where, this is a transformation where I think we have an opportunity to drive forward a change and sort of equalize the gender balance in this industry.
Thank you. And Sarah, just to wrap up before, if we've got time, we'll open the questions up to the floor quickly. But do you think this will lead to ultimately more diverse leadership within shipping companies?
I do believe it will open the door, but creating opportunity is only the first step. We need to translate this into real change at the leadership level. Companies must make a conscious and sustained effort to nurture and promote female talent. It's not just enough to open the door to, we need to ensure that women are supported in climbing the ladder, whether that's through mentoring, tailored leadership development, or structured succession planning. It's one of the things that came through that IMO WISTA reports was this concept of a broken ladder, that women are able to enter the industry, but they're not able to make that next progress into leadership roles. And so I think we need to look into, companies need to look into really instilling these values, as mentioned by Hannah and Lesley. It comes from the top down, but we also need some grassroots actions as well to promote and make sure we've got the pipeline, but also the support from the top. I think Lesley made a comment about the shadow of the boards sort of making, and then it's sort of rippling through the company. And I really like that image. It comes from the top and it stills down. So I do think there's going to be more opportunities and it will lead to more diverse leadership, but it's going to be a combined effort. It needs corporate level. It needs all of us here to try and do our best for informal or formal mentoring, sitting on panels. But as we're sitting on the panel here today, there are leadership opportunities for women, but I think there's more to be done.
No, absolutely. I think that's so insightful. And actually, I really liked Hannah's analogy earlier of sort of, working with female leaders who don't pull the ladder up. I think it's something definitely to think about. Thank you both of you for some really, really insightful comments. I realise we are now running out of time or running over actually, but we'll briefly just head over to the Q&A section just to sort of get a bit of a feel from any audience questions. The first one I think has come in is
should I take
Hannah, is that your one?
Yeah. So we've got 3 questions. So I think probably the first one, if I could direct it to Hannah and Lesley. I think to some extent we covered this earlier, but it is a really interesting question. So let's revisit it, which is how ship owners and operators create safer and more inclusive environments on board vessels. Safer and more inclusive for women. Lesley, did you want to go first?
Thank you. It's obviously a critical question. I think, I'm just conscious we might end up repeating some of these things because first of all, I think it needs to be a key pillar of a people strategy. And the people strategy needs to underpin the business strategy. So it's not just the people team talking about this, inclusivity and safe. It's the business that's talking about this. But the CPO at the table, I think, needs to be the champion and probably alongside the chief operating officer, depending how your structure is. But what I mean is it's more than just one person. It's a climate, it's a culture, it's a way of being, it's a behaviour. And I feel I'm not actually giving a specific example. I think the more one of the panel, it might have been Hannah, was talking about role models. The fact we had 66% females on our exec committee did create an environment. It did give a message to the business, and we were out in the business all the time. So I think visibility, that expression, you've got to walk the talk. And if I give you a specific example on the safety point, we obviously had 0 tolerance on alcohol. I want to come back to the sexual harassment point and safety around women feeling safe in that environment. We had 0 tolerance, as you would expect, on board for when you are on your working pattern, on your roster. What I then found out was that when the ship was in dry dock, the crew could go off site, and I think it's called the Seafarers Mission. They could go and have a drink and then come back because the ship wasn't going anywhere. It was a very small sort of caretaking operation while the ship was in dry dock. And we then had bad behaviour, you know, whether it be fighting chefs, as we called it, the 3 fighting chefs, which was another issue, or poor behaviour between a male and a female. And so I absolutely lobbied and spoke to the safety director about the fact we had to now say 0 tolerance, and we've got to work with the trade unions to achieve that when the ship's in dry dock. Now, it doesn't solve everything, and it's not an excuse, but judgment is flawed when people have a drink.
Yeah.
And we achieved that. And funnily enough, the case is dropped. So it was a very strong message to our people, something that we put safety at all times first. So, okay, for some people, they liked to go and have a drink and the ship was in dry dock, so it was safe, and they didn't like that. But the bigger message was the one that absolutely people respected.
Yeah. And just thinking with my employment lawyer hat on, just because it's in a pub off the ship doesn't mean it's not an extension of the working environment.
Yeah.
There can still be vicarious liability. So just thinking about the legal issue.
Yeah. So we stopped it.
It's very real. But I think, sort of going back to what you said at the beginning of your answer, one of the recurrent messages that I've noticed coming through from today is that we can't operate in silos and see D&I as just a little box. Yes, I agree with you. It's for the CPO or the D&I representative to explain the business case and the financial imperative, but then everybody has to champion it and get involved. So I think that's a really good takeaway from today. Hannah, did you want to just come in with your thoughts on that question?
Yes, thank you very much, Anna. And actually, I think partly inspired by Lesley's response as well, I think that if we're wanting to make this a sort of more accessible concept, particularly for, as I was saying earlier, some of the smaller operators whose focus may actually start from the perspective of compliance, you know, you do also have to recognize that, you know, as women, we're all very different as well. And, you know, for some, it can be an extremely daunting environment to walk into. And for others, it's you speak to them and it's as easy as their ABCs, you know, that it's entirely dependent on the person. And I suppose that is really, really the point, you know. If you're wanting to make the industry as a whole, you know, sort of more accessible for women to want to join, to stay in it and be more an attractive career for them, what we really need to be doing is starting from the viewpoint that we want to take away the sort of little worries, as it were, that can impact a woman's choice, you know, reduce the risks of the potential friction that could mean that being a woman is a barrier to their progression in their career. And, you know, it might sound flippant, but actually I quite liked Sarah's point earlier about providing the right size PPE. And I know it sounds extremely simple, but if you put yourself in the position that as a female seafarer, you are having to put on a pair of overalls that are slightly ill-fitting around the chest area, they're slightly too long in the arms and the legs, you know, already what you are doing is putting that female seafarer in a position of feeling like a sort of other, you know, feeling as if they don't belong or that they're not part of a team, because actually, you know, everyone else can put it on just fine, nobody else feels unsafe in it but you, type of thing. And all of a sudden you're now putting the burden on that female seafarer to sort of stick their hand up and say, you know, actually I think I need something slightly different for me. So I do think that it can be daunting for businesses and not knowing where to start, but I do think that looking at it from the perspective of putting yourself in a woman's shoes in that position, you know, taking away, as I say, that sort of the little worries that mean that their gender could be a potential barrier, I think is quite an accessible, shall we say, place to start, I think.
Yeah, because it, you know, it might seem like a trivial point, but actually if that's what you're wearing all day, every day, it's really important. So, you know, small change, big impact, I suppose.
Exactly.
And it's a big problem, but let's just keep chipping away with it with the small solutions, if I can put it that way.
Kate, I think we probably could talk about this all day, couldn't we?
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry.
I mean, it's so interesting, and actually, I've really enjoyed sort of having the 2 parts of the webinar and learning about, you know, that there's such a lot of crossover, I think, which is really fascinating, and we'll have to carry on the conversation next time, perhaps with a couple of men on our panel as well. But thank you so much to everyone who joined us today in the audience to help us belatedly mark International Day for Women in Maritime, and thank you also so much to Sarah, Lesley, Hannah, and Yan, your time and really interesting insights. They've given us all so much to think about going forward. I hope that this session has also inspired sort of everyone to continue the conversation, challenge the status quo, and champion diversity in shipping. So thank you all so much for joining.